Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're opening up a file that's just, well, thick with courage, unimaginable horror, and frankly one of the most profound miscarriages of justice in American military history. We are talking about the final secret mission, the absolutely devastating destruction, and the ultimate injustice surrounding the USS Indianapolis.
It really is. When you dig into the sources, it's a narrative that feels almost mythical in its cruelty. So let's set the scene. It's August 2nd, 1945. We're in the middle of the Philippine Sea. The Second World War is truly in its final bloody days. But somehow this flagship of the U.S. Fifth Fleet, a heavy cruiser, 610 feet long, vanished. Just vanished without a trace for 4 days and 5 nights.
4 days and 5 nights.
And that systemic failure, that blind spot, it left nearly 900 men adrift, just floating, battling exposure, thirst, sharks.
And the only reason any of them, that 316 who did survive, made it out was basically down to pure chance. An accident. It's kind of the hook that just pulls you straight into this whole disaster, isn't it?
Absolutely. The documents detailing the discovery, they really underscore how thin that line was between survival and just total oblivion. You've got Lieutenant Wilbur Chuck Gwynn. He's flying a pretty routine anti-submarine patrol, in the PV-1 Ventura bomber. Probably pretty tedious duty by that point in the war, mostly just empty ocean.
Right, and he wasn't even meant to be looking out that window at that moment, was he? I mean, the sequence is almost absurdly mundane, but it leads to this life-altering discovery.
Exactly. Gwynn was actually distracted. There was a mechanical issue. A trailing radio antenna had snapped loose, and it was just whipping around wildly back there. So he hands the controls to his co-pilot, squeezes back into the fuselage hot, cramped, and he's trying to wrestle this antenna wire back into place, and he gets this sharp, painful crick in his neck from being all hunched over.
Just trying to get comfortable, stretches his neck.
Instinctively, yeah, just looking for relief. He stretches, glances out this small gun blister window, and from 3,000 feet up, he spots something odd. At first, just a dark smudge on the water, an oil slick, maybe half a mile long or so.
And his first thought is, enemy submarine. A target?
Exactly. Disabled Japanese sub, potential kill. So he banks the plane sharply, drops down to maybe 900 feet just to confirm what he's seeing. But as that smudge comes into focus, it's not a submarine. It resolves into this scene of just absolute unimaginable horror. Dozens and dozens of tiny human heads bobbing in the water, scattered across this oil slick. Gaunt, sun-blistered faces, all covered in thick black fuel oil. You realized instantly this wasn't a target. He was looking at hundreds of dying American sailors.
Wow. That one involuntary glance saved whoever was left. So our mission today, then, is to take this initial moment of horror and really unpack the whole chain of events, the command failures, the deadly strategic secrecy, the bureaucratic rules that just let the flagship of the Fifth Fleet disappear for the map for over 100 hours without a single alarm going off.
Yeah, and to really grasp the scale of this, you first have to understand what the USS Indianapolis was, the Indy, as they called her. This wasn't just any ship. She was a heavy cruiser, CA-35, highly decorated. The actual flagship for Admiral Raymond Spruance's Fifth Fleet, a big deal.
She'd definitely seen action. A hardened veteran, right? 10 brutal Pacific campaigns under her belt, including Iwo Jima, and the sources really highlight her toughness. Off Okinawa, she took a really bad kamikaze hit, but the crew fought the fires, controlled the flooding, saved the ship, got her back to the States for repair.
And it was exactly that. Her demonstrated speed, reliability, that toughness, that made her the perfect, if maybe unlikely, candidate for something called Operation Centerboard. This was, you could argue, the single most important naval mission of the entire war. And it kicks off July 16th, 1945, at the Mare Island Naval Shipyard back in California.
And the secrecy around this was just off the charts, wasn't it? Captain Charles Butler McVay III, career Navy guy, respected family name. He wasn't told what he was carrying.
Not a thing. Absolutely nothing. His orders were simply, get this cargo delivered as fast as humanly possible. That was it. The crew, based on survivor accounts, they had all sorts of wild guesses. They thought maybe specialized medical supplies, maybe gold bullion. Somebody even joked it was fancy toilet paper for General MacArthur. The reality, though, was so much more profound, so much heavier.
Yeah, the sources confirm it. They were carrying the literal heart of the weapon that would finally end the war. The atomic bomb, little boy. But it wasn't just one piece, was it?
No, that's right. It was split into two critical parts. First, this massive plywood crate, apparently the size of a small car, welded right onto the hangar deck floor. That held the complex gun trigger mechanism, the firing device for the bomb.
And the second piece, the core itself.
Yes, a much smaller but incredibly heavy lead-lined metal cylinder that was carried aboard by 2 Army officers under heavy guard. Inside was the enriched uranium-235 core. So McVay's ship is essentially a floating nuclear weapon delivery system sailing completely alone across the Pacific.
You just have to imagine the pressure on McVay. He's given this directive that basically says, every hour you shave off this trip might shorten the war, save Allied lives.
And he took that to heart completely. The Indianapolis just raced across the Pacific, absolutely flew. She shattered the existing speed records, set a time from San Francisco to Pearl Harbor that apparently still stands for a military vessel on that route.
Incredible speed. They delivered the components to Tinian, mission accomplished, on July 26th. And the relief among the crew must have been immense. We should remember, the sources point out, the Indy had a mix. Lots of seasoned veterans, sure, but also a high number of really young guys.
Right.
Teenagers, many just 18, 19 years old, probably terrified for much of the war.
Yeah. For them, the big dangerous mission was over. The Great Secret was delivered safely. They spent maybe a day refueling, then set course for Leyte in the Philippines. Just routine training, that's what they were told. In their minds, they were finally sailing into the relative safety of the rear echelon, the war's backwater, some called it. They figured the real danger was behind them.
A huge collective sigh of relief, which, as we now know, was just tragically misplaced. They were steaming directly towards a waiting, very capable enemy, and they had absolutely no idea.
Right. So while the crew of the Indianapolis felt they were heading for quieter waters, the American naval command structure actually had intelligence that painted a very different picture, a much more dangerous one. And here we need to introduce the other key player in this deadly game. Lieutenant Commander Mochitsura Hashimoto. He was the captain of the Japanese submarine I-58.
And the sources don't portray him as some desperate, last-ditch fanatic, do they? More like a really skilled, patient, professional submarine commander.
Exactly. A master of his trade, operating with calculated precision. And this brings us squarely to the strategic failure, the intelligence blind spot. The U.S. Navy possessed this incredibly powerful, war-winning secret weapon, ultra intelligence.
Okay, let's unpack ultra a bit, because it's so central to what happens to the Indy. What exactly was it?
So ultra was the code name for intelligence gathered by breaking Japan's highest-level naval codes. JN-25B, primarily. This wasn't just intercepting random messages. This let the Allied command read Japanese fleet orders, predict movements, plan ambushes, know where their subs were. It gave them this colossal, almost decisive strategic advantage across the entire Pacific. It was considered so vital, so incredibly valuable, that protecting the source of ultra, the fact they could read the codes, was paramount, above almost everything else.
And what did ultra intercepts show about convoy route Petty? That's the path the Indy was taking from Guam to Leyte.
It showed that route was hot, really hot. The ultra intercepts were clear. At least 4 Japanese submarines, including Hashimoto's I-58, were actively patrolling right along that specific shipping lane. And the danger wasn't theoretical. It was proven, known, specific. They had location data.
And the proof was already there, wasn't it? Just days before, July 24th, the destroyer escort USS Underhill had been sunk. Right there, in that same area, by a Japanese sub, likely using Keaton torpedoes. So the Navy knew the hunters were active in that exact zone, and they knew the Indy was sailing right into it unescorted.
And this is where the decision-making just falls apart catastrophically. Captain McVay, when he stopped at Guam, he did the prudent thing. He requested a destroyer escort for the journey to Leyte, standard procedure in potentially dangerous waters.
And he was denied, flat out denied. The reason given was that escorts were scarce, needed for upcoming invasions, high-priority troop convoys.
Right. Now, denying the escort, while maybe frustrating for McVay, could possibly be justified under the immense pressures of the final stages of the war. Resources were stretched thin, but the real unforgivable failure was coupling that denial with keeping him in the dark. McVay was explicitly not told about the Underhill sinking nearby. And crucially, he was not told about the specific confirmed threat from those active Japanese subs that ultra had identified right on his path.
This is the really critical, almost chilling part. The system actively chose to protect the source of the intelligence over protecting the ship. How did they rationalize withholding potentially life-saving information from a captain heading into known danger?
The logic, however cold it seems now, was rooted in maintaining that huge strategic edge ultra provided. The fear was, if they warned McVay based on ultra-RA and he then took drastic, evasive action like constant aggressive zigzagging or a major route change, the Japanese might notice the pattern. They might deduce that their codes were compromised. And losing ultra-RA meant losing the ability to anticipate all major Japanese naval operations across the Pacific. So the calculation was made somewhere up the chain that the potential loss of a single cruiser was an acceptable risk to keep the larger code-breaking secret safe.
Wow. It created this deadly institutional blind spot specifically for McVay. And he was a former intelligence officer himself, right? He would have trusted the system.
Absolutely. He trusted that if there was a known, credible threat, naval intelligence or operations would tell him. So his working assumption became fatally flawed. No warning must mean no threat. He assumed, reasonably from his perspective, that he was moving into relatively safe waters. The very high-level secrecy that had successfully protected the atomic bomb components and was helping win the war now, ironically, turned back and condemned the captain and his crew.
So on July 28th, the USS Indianapolis sailed from Guam, unescorted, unwarned, blind, steaming directly towards its fate.
Yeah, the sinking itself was just this awful convergence of vulnerability, bad luck, and that intelligence failure. The final night, July 29th, 1945, was incredibly hot and humid out there in the Philippine Sea. We need to picture the ship itself. The Indy was a pre-war design, a treaty cruiser, built back when naval treaties limited tonnage. That often meant compromises, like maybe thinner hull plating, less robust internal compartmentalization compared to the newer wartime ships.
And critically, as you mentioned, designed for the cooler Atlantic. It was severely lacking in air conditioning, which must have been brutal in the tropics.
Absolutely brutal. Below decks, the air was just stagnant, thick, stifling. The sources estimate hundreds of men, maybe 300 or 400, just seeking any kind of relief, were sleeping out on the open steel deck, trying to catch even the slightest breeze. That small measure of comfort tragically put them right in the path of either immediate survival, flung clear into the water, or instant death when the torpedoes hit.
Now let's talk about the zigzagging. That became the crux of the court-martial later. McVay stopped the defensive zigzag maneuver just before 8:00 p.m. that night.
He did. His standing orders gave him discretion on zigzagging. Visibility was poor at the time he made the call. It was overcast. The horizon wasn't clear. So he judged the risk of submarine attack to be minimal in those conditions. He ceased the maneuver, which, saves fuel and is less taxing on the crew and the engines. He then retired to his sea cabin around 11:00 p.m., leaving standard night orders with the officer of the deck. Call him if visibility changed significantly or if there were any contacts.
And that change in visibility just a little later became absolutely catastrophic.
Just after 11:00 p.m., the clouds broke, just parted, and the moon came out. And in that instant, the massive dark silhouette of the 610-foot cruiser stood out starkly against the moonlit horizon. For Commander Hashimoto in the I-58, looking through his periscope, it was a perfect textbook target presented on a platter.
Hashimoto actually misidentified it initially, didn't he? He thought it was something even bigger, like an Idaho-class battleship.
He did. He was understandably ecstatic. His crew immediately urged him, "Use the Ķētons, use the Ķētons." These were the manned suicide torpedoes. Terrifying weapons. But Hashimoto refused. The target was too good, too close, only about 1,500 meters away. Why risk a complex, potentially unreliable suicide weapon when a conventional torpedo spread was almost guaranteed to hit? He wanted a clean, professional kill.
He didn't need a desperate measure. He had the perfect shot.
He fired 6 Type 95 torpedoes, and these were they were the best in the world at the time. Long lance torpedoes. Fast, powerful, long range. He fired them in a fan-wise spread. Now that's important. A fan spread is designed specifically to increase the probability of hitting a target. Even if the target is actively zigzagging, that detail becomes absolutely critical later.
The ship just sailing straight in that moment under the moonlight. Yeah. Never saw them coming.
14 minutes past midnight, July 30th, 1945, the first torpedo hit. Right in the bow. The descriptions from survivors are horrific, an instant violent explosion. It sheared off somewhere between 40 and 65 feet of the ship's forward section. Just gone. Lights flickered, died across the ship.
And then the second hit, the one that really sealed its fate.
Yeah, the second torpedo struck amidships, right below the bridge area near the number 2 smokestack. It punched through the relatively thin hull plating and detonated in the worst possible place, hitting aviation fuel tanks and a powder magazine simultaneously. The resulting explosion was just tremendous. A massive pillar of fire shot hundreds of feet into the night sky. All electrical power died instantly. Communications went dead. The ship was plunged into this terrifying darkness, lit only by the raging fires.
Captain McVay was literally thrown from his bunk. He makes it to the bridge, finds total chaos. Communications out. He orders the navigator to send a distress message, but in the smoke and confusion, he couldn't even confirm if it actually got sent. The damage is just too severe too fast.
The ship's death throes were shockingly quick. The executive officer somehow reached the bridge, found McVay, and delivered the absolutely grim assessment. "Captain, I think we are finished. I recommend we abandon ship." There was no time for formal alarms, no bells, no klaxons.
The order had to go by word of mouth, shouted through the darkness, the smoke, the chaos. All hands topside to abandon ship. Abandon ship.
But the Indy was already listing heavily, violently. It went from 30 degrees to 65, then just rolled right over to 90 degrees onto its side. Men were scrambling up, or rather across, the slick, now vertical steel deck. Many were trapped below decks. Many of those sleeping topside were just flung clear into the oily water. In just 12 minutes. 12 minutes from that first torpedo impact, the 610-foot flagship cruiser was gone. Slipped beneath the waves, taking about 300 men down with her, but leaving nearly 900 others behind, scattered, stunned, covered in oil, floating in the immense dark ocean.
12 minutes to sink, and then 4 days and 5 nights. Just adrift, that longest watch imaginable. We've covered the violence of the sinking, but the real unfolding tragedy, the man-made part of the horror, is how the Navy just lost them. How they allowed them to stay out there unnoticed for over 100 hours.
Yeah, the immediate aftermath in the water was just shock and chaos, compounded by that thick black fuel oil. It coated everything, burned their eyes, made it hard to see, hard to breathe. The men were scattered, mostly in small groups, clinging to debris, some in life rafts, many just in life jackets.
Yeah.
Most had no water, no food, no medical supplies. Dr. Lewis Haynes, the ship's chief medical officer, despite being injured himself, immediately started trying to organize things, doing triage among the floating survivors.
His actions, they really speak volumes about the character of those men, don't they? The sources describe this grim, heartbreaking task he took on, going from man to man in the water, checking who was alive, who wasn't, and removing life jackets from the dead.
He had to. It was a brutal necessity. He'd check them pupils fixed and dilated meant they were gone. He'd try to get their dog tags if he could. He would say the Lord's Prayer over them and then just release the body. That precious life jacket could save someone else still clinging on.
The environment itself became the primary enemy, didn't it? Just relentless, unforgiving. Daytime meant the blistering sun, the unbearable thirst. The heat, mixed with the caustic fuel oil and salt water, just burned their skin raw. Blistered messes.
And dehydration set in fast, escalating quickly into severe psychological trauma. Salt poisoning was especially vicious. Survivors talked about men becoming delirious, drinking the seawater out of sheer desperation. That, of course, just speeds up kidney failure, causes intense swelling of the lips and tongue. And then came the hallucinations. Men seeing crystal clear phantom islands just over the horizon, or hearing the ship's water fountains, the scuttlebutts, still running somewhere below the waves, driving them mad, making them swim off alone, diving down, never to return.
That breakdown, that inability to tell reality from delusion, must have been utterly terrifying for the ones trying to hold on to their sanity, trying to keep the groups together.
It was a complete breakdown of mind and body. And then, of course, there was the other horror. The predators. The sources are clear. The oceanic white-tip sharks arrived around dawn on that first morning, drawn by the underwater vibrations from the explosions, and inevitably, the presence of blood.
This is the part of the story that's almost become legend, the Jaws monologue effect. But the reality of those attacks must have been just beyond comprehension.
Marine Edgar Harrell's testimony is particularly harrowing. He described how they tried to form defensive circles, kicking, splashing, trying to keep the circling shadows at bay. He talked about hearing the blood-curdling scream in the dark, and the sudden horrific realization that the man next to you was just gone, or seeing torsos floating that were completely exposed, vulnerable targets in the shark's domain.
Yet it's crucial, isn't it? The survivors' own accounts, the official records, they reveal something important. The sharks, while a terrifying and visceral threat, weren't actually the biggest killer out there.
That's the grim truth that sometimes gets lost in the more sensational tellings. Far more men succumbed to the elements, to the systemic failure to rescue them. The relentless sun, the crippling dehydration, the effects of saltwater poisoning, the descent into madness. That slow, agonizing attrition claimed far more lives than the sharks did. It was an ordeal the system could have and should have prevented, or at least shortened.
Which brings us right back to that massive institutional failure. Why? Why did the most powerful Navy on the planet not realize its own fleet flagship was missing for over 80 hours? 80 hours.
It was this catastrophic cascade of procedural failures, and it started with a seemingly logical, even mundane, bureaucratic directive, something designed purely for efficiency. Pacific Fleet Confidential Letter 10CL-45.
It's a fatal directive, designed to cut down on radio chatter.
Yep. Exactly. The rear areas of the Pacific, like Leyte, were swamped with radio traffic. Ships arriving, departing, routine messages. It was clogging the airwaves. So, to manage this, 10CL-45 mandated that arrival reports shall not be made for combatant ships when they arrived at secure rear area ports like Leyte. The thinking was, if a major warship arrives safely at a secure base, it didn't need to waste bandwidth reporting that fact. Assume it arrived unless told otherwise.
So if routine arrivals weren't reported, then non-arrivals weren't flagged as emergencies. The paperwork was designed to ignore success, which inadvertently meant it was designed to ignore failure too.
It created this incredibly dangerous loophole. When the Indianapolis failed to show up at Leyte on schedule, July 31st, no immediate alarm bells went off, because nobody was expecting an arrival report from her anyway, per 10CL-45. Then came the second failure, right there in the operations plotting room at Leyte headquarters.
Well, watch officer, Lieutenant Stuart Gibson.
Right. Gibson noticed on the plotting board that the Indy was overdue. But, operating under the assumptions baked into the system by 10CL-45 and just general wartime can-do mentality, perhaps, he didn't investigate. He simply assumed the ship must have been diverted somewhere else, maybe Palau, maybe back to Guam for new orders, and hadn't radioed her change of plans because of the radio silence rules. So he committed the fatal procedural act. He erased the Indy's plot marker from the board, just wipe her off.
Procedurally, the ship just ceased to exist in the Navy's tracking system.
Okay.
Vanished not because of the torpedoes hitting her, but because of a bureaucratic rule and a lazy assumption.
She became a ghost ship. As far as the Light Command was concerned, she wasn't technically missing, she was simply assumed diverted. The Navy literally had no standard operating procedure, no protocol to initiate a search for an overdue combatant ship in a rear area under these circumstances.
But surely, what about distress signals? The official Navy record, even today, denies that any confirmed SOS from the Indy was ever received. But was the ship truly silent after the attack?
Well, the official Navy line has remained consistent on that point. No confirmed reception logged through standard channels. However, there are persistent, credible, though officially unconfirmed, claims that an SOS was sent and, crucially, that it might have been received but ignored. The source material highlights the really shocking sworn testimony of a yeoman named Claire B. Young. He was stationed at the naval base in Leyte. Young swore under oath later that he personally received a coded SOS signal during his watch that night. He decoded it, and it identified the USS Indianapolis and gave its approximate location.
And he reported it up the chain to his commanding officer, Commodore Jacob H. Jacobson.
According to Young's testimony, yes. He woke Jacobson immediately. Jacobson, Young alleged, smelled strongly of alcohol at the time. He supposedly read the decoded message and then just dismissed it, said it was irrelevant, maybe a trick, maybe just not important enough to act on immediately. He supposedly told Young, no reply at this time, and went back to bed.
If true, that's just staggering negligence. Criminal negligence, almost.
And it might not have been the only mischance. Other reports, less detailed perhaps, suggest that faint distress signals, possibly from the Indy, were picked up by at least 2 other naval radio stations in the region, but they too were apparently dismissed. At one station, the commander had given strict orders not to be disturbed during the night for anything less than a major fleet action. At another, officers reportedly feared the signal might be a Japanese deception, a trick to lure unsuspecting rescue ships into a submarine ambush.
So you have this confluence of wartime paranoia, rigid adherence to flawed protocols, maybe some personal failings, sheer complacency. And it meant that potentially 3 separate opportunities to realize the Indy was in distress and initiate a rescue were lost. Just lost. Condemning those men to 3 more days of absolute hell in the water. Okay. So you have this total blackout. The intelligence failure beforehand, the 10CL-45 directive causing the non-arrival to be ignored, the plotting room error wiping the ship off the map, the possibly ignored SOS calls. It created this 4-day void. The eventual rescue, starting with Lieutenant Gwynn's accidental sighting, was almost a miracle. And it was driven by individual acts of defiance, wasn't it?
It truly was. When the first rescue planes, like the PBY Catalinas, arrived on scene, their initial orders were basically reconnaissance. Map the debris field, count survivors if possible, call in surface ships. Lieutenant Adrian Marks, piloting one of these PBYs, had very explicit orders: do not land. These big flying boats weren't designed for landing in open, rough ocean swells. It was incredibly dangerous.
But seeing the reality down there, seeing men being attacked by sharks, dying right in front of him, that changed things.
Completely. When Marks flew over and saw sharks actively attacking groups of survivors, saw men clearly dying from exhaustion and exposure right below his wings, he broke the rules. He ignored the direct order. He made this incredibly harrowing, totally unauthorized landing in what were reported as 12-foot swells. He risked his own plane, his own crew. It was an act of sheer compassionate defiance.
That's the definition of heroism right there. Putting others before the regulations, before your own safety.
Absolutely. His crew immediately began pulling men out of the water, hauling them into the crowded PBY. When the inside of the plane was completely packed, they rescued 56 men. That way they started using parachute cord to literally tie other survivors to the outside of the wings. These men lay lashed down on the wings, riding out the heavy seas all night. The plane itself was damaged, partially flooded, but it acted as this crucial makeshift lifeboat and beacon until the first surface ships arrived at dawn.
And that PBY, sitting there in the water, helped guide the destroyers in.
Yes. As night fell again, the destroyer USS Cecil Doyle arrived. Its captain made another incredibly brave decision. He turned on the ship's searchlights, illuminating the entire rescue area. Now, this made his destroyer a perfect, brightly lit target for any Japanese subs that might still be lurking nearby. But it was essential for guiding the other rescue vessels and boats to the scattered groups of survivors in the darkness. When the whole terrible operation finally concluded, the numbers were stark. Out of the 11,196 men who had sailed on the Indy's final voyage, about 900 had made it into the water after the sinking. Only 316 were ultimately pulled out alive.
So the war ends just days later. VJ Day. America celebrates this hard-won victory, a victory partially enabled by the Indy's secret cargo delivery. But that euphoria quickly slammed head-on to the public horror and outrage over the loss of 880 lives on the Indianapolis. The Navy, facing immense public pressure, needing to explain this colossal failure, the intelligence gaps, the procedural errors. They needed a narrative. They needed someone to blame. They needed a scapegoat.
And that scapegoat, tragically, unfairly, became Captain Charles Butler McVay III.
Even though Admiral Chester Nimitz, the revered commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet, the man who led the victory, reviewed the initial court of inquiry findings, he saw the bigger picture, didn't he?
He did. Nimitz recognized this was a tragedy born from the fog of war, compounded by systemic failures far beyond McVay's control. He recommended only a formal letter of reprimand for McVay, acknowledging the loss, but not assigning criminal blame. But Nimitz was overruled. He was overruled by Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations back in Washington. King was known for being exceptionally tough, maybe even vindictive. He ordered a full, formal court-martial for McVay. The main charge was hazarding his ship by failing to take proper defensive measures. And some sources strongly suggest King's insistence might have been colored by a decades-old personal grudge he held against McVay's father, who was also a respected admiral, adding this layer of potential personal vendetta to the institutional need to assign blame.
It says a lot about the power dynamics, doesn't it? The top commander in the Pacific, Nimitz, basically gets sidelined by someone higher up, possibly driven by old grievances.
It does. So the court-martial focused primarily on two charges. The first one, that McVay failed to give a timely abandoned ship order, was quickly dismissed. The evidence showed the ship sank so incredibly fast it was impossible. So the entire weight of the Navy's case came down to that second charge, hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag in the hours before the attack.
That one discretionary decision McVay made based on poor visibility. And to bolster their case on this single point, the Navy did something truly unprecedented, even shocking at the time.
The shocking testimony, yeah. They flew the enemy commander, Lieutenant Commander Morchitsura Hashimoto, the man who actually sank the ship, all the way from occupied Japan to Washington, D.C. They put him up in a hotel, treated him almost like a VIP witness. They brought him into the court-martial to testify against Captain McVay. It was this piece of military legal theater clearly designed to get Hashimoto to say, yes, if he'd been zigzagging, I couldn't have hit him. That would seal McVay's fate.
But Hashimoto didn't play along, did he? He didn't give him the validation they were looking for.
No. When Hashimoto took the stand, under oath, he was asked directly, would zigzagging have saved the Indianapolis? And his response, as a professional submariner, completely undercut the Navy's entire case. He testified clearly that because he fired his torpedoes in a wide, fanned-out spread, a tactic specifically designed to counter zigzagging, it would have made no change in the method of firing. And crucially, he stated he would have been able to launch a successful torpedo attack against his ship, whether it had been zigzagging or not, given the conditions and his position.
So the man who fired the torpedoes, so the defensive mover McVay was being court-martialed for not doing, wouldn't have made a difference anyway. And American submarine experts at the time agreed, right? Calling zigzagging in that situation of negligible value.
Exactly. It should have destroyed the prosecution's case. But it didn't matter. The court-martial board found Captain McVay guilty. Guilty of hazarding his ship by failing to zigzag. He became the only U.S. Navy captain in the entire history of the Navy to be court-martialed for losing his ship as a direct result of an enemy act of war during wartime. The conviction stood, even though his actual sentence loss of seniority was later remitted by the Secretary of the Navy upon Nimitz's recommendation.
So he was allowed to stay in the Navy, eventually retired as a Rear Admiral in 1949. But that conviction, that official finding of guilt, remained on his record. A permanent stain. That must have been an unbearable weight to carry.
The official stain was bad enough, but his real ongoing punishment came not from the Navy, but from the American public. Specifically from some of the grieving families who had lost sons on the Indy. For 23 years, McVay was relentlessly tormented. A steady stream of hate mail, venomous phone calls, especially around Christmas and other holidays. The sources quote some of the devastating letters, things like, "Merry Christmas, our family's holiday would be merrier if you hadn't killed our son."
Just brutal. That immense burden of guilt, which really belonged to the whole system. The flawed procedures, the intelligence secrecy, the communication breakdowns, was forced entirely onto the shoulders and conscience of one man.
The psychological toll was just immense, relentless. Finally, in November 1968, apparently unable to endure the harassment and the weight of it all any longer, Captain McVay walked out onto his front lawn in Litchfield, Connecticut. He was wearing his Navy uniform, he took his service revolver, and he ended his own life. They found him holding a small toy sailor in his hand, a sentimental keepsake his own father had given him when he was a boy.
God, what a tragic end. That terrible injustice, McVay's suicide. It really could have been the final bitter chapter in the Indianapolis story, but it wasn't. Thanks largely to the fierce, unwavering loyalty of the ship's survivors and, incredibly, a determined 12-year-old boy.
Yeah, the story took this completely unexpected turn in 1996. With Hunter Scott, a 12-year-old middle school student down in Pensacola, Florida. The sources say he first got interested after seeing the movie Jaws. You know, the famous scene where Robert Shaw's character, Quint, gives that chilling monologue about surviving the Indianapolis sinking. Scott chose the Indy for his National History Day project, did some initial research, and was just stunned to learn about McVay's court-martial and his suicide. He couldn't believe it.
And this school project just kind of snowballed, didn't it? It became much more than just a history report.
It really did. Scott dove deep. He started tracking down and interviewing the actual survivors of the Indianapolis. He eventually spoke with nearly 150 of them. And what he found was this incredible unified front. These men, now mostly in their 70s and 80s, had been fighting quietly, persistently for decades to clear their captain's name. They universally described McVay as a good man, a competent commander, a hero who had been deliberately scapegoated to cover up the Navy's mistakes. They gave Hunter Scott the first-hand accounts, the documents, the ammunition he needed.
So, armed with Scott's meticulous research, which laid out the withheld ulti-jode intelligence, the evidence of ignored SOS calls, and crucially, the transcript of Hashimoto's court-martial testimony saying zigzagging wouldn't have mattered, the survivors took their fight back to Washington.
Many of these elderly veterans traveled to D.C. They testified powerfully before congressional committees. Their message was clear, and it was blunt. Captain McVay was made a scapegoat, pure and simple, sacrificed to divert attention from the terrible loss of life caused by procedural mistakes made far above his pay grade. They weren't looking for revenge. They were demanding accountability for the system that had failed both them and their captain.
And the push for justice got this incredible, almost poetic boost from an unexpected source, bringing the whole story full circle.
Mochitsura Hashimoto, the former enemy submarine commander who had sunk the Indianapolis. By this time, he was an elderly Shinto priest in Japan. Having followed the story, he wrote this powerful, formal letter addressed to the U.S. Senate. He wrote it in support of McVay's exoneration. He pleaded, essentially. Our peoples have forgiven each other for that terrible war and its consequences. Perhaps it is time your peoples finally forgave Captain McVay for the humiliation of his unjust conviction.
Wow. The moral authority of the survivors, combined with the plea for forgiveness from the former enemy commander, that had to be incredibly powerful.
It was undeniable. Congress acted. On October 30th, 2055, long years after the sinking Congress passed a joint resolution, President Bill Clinton signed it into law. It officially declared Captain Charles Butler McVay III exonerated for the loss of the USS Indianapolis. Now, the conviction itself technically remains in the Navy archives. They couldn't expunge it, but this resolution officially removed the stain of guilt from his name and his record.
Finally, justice of a sort after more than half a century. And the ship itself, its final resting place.
That remained a mystery for decades longer. But in August 2017, a research vessel funded by the late Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft, finally located the wreckage. The wreck of the USS Indianapolis rests upright on the floor of the Philippine Sea, incredibly deep, about 18,000 feet down. It's now officially designated and protected as a U.S. military war grave, a silent, final memorial to the ship and the nearly 900 men who lost their lives. Hashtag outro.
So when you look back at the sinking of the USS Indianapolis, it was undeniably a moment of profound, terrible tragedy and war. An enemy submarine did its job. But the sheer scale of the loss of life, those 880 souls who perished in the water over 4 days, that was fundamentally a man-made disaster. He was hugely magnified by bureaucratic failures like Confidential Letter 10-CL-45, by the obsession with intelligence secrecy around OLTRA, and by that shocking systemic gap, having no effective search protocol for an overdue major warship in what was considered a rear area.
Yeah, and if you want to connect this whole narrative back to, the kind of insights we look for in these deep dives, the overarching lesson here is just chillingly clear. This is perhaps the definitive example of how systems and procedures, even those designed with logical goals like achieving greater strategic efficiency, like reducing radio traffic, or rigorously protecting vital intelligence sources, how those very systems, when applied too rigidly, without flexibility or common sense, can create this chain reaction, a cascade of catastrophic tactical vulnerabilities. And then, when that flawed system inevitably breaks down and demands accountability, it doesn't reform itself. It finds an individual, someone like Captain McVay, to bear the crushing weight of the institution's collective failure and guilt.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought for you to consider. Captain McVay was condemned by the very system he served loyally his entire life. Yet his ultimate, posthumous exoneration didn't come from within that system. It required decades of relentless effort by the men who survived under his command, and remarkably, the moral intervention of the very enemy commander who sank his ship. So what does that tell you about the true nature of honor, of loyalty, of command? When the victims and even the former foe, not the institution itself, have to fight for over half a century just to clear the name of the man who was forced to carry that institution's guilt.
And so, another chapter closes. For more journeys into history's forgotten files, please like and subscribe. Your next story awaits.